Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first ever Fantasy Formula pre-qualifying lineup lock live show. So for anybody who hasn't met us before, I'm Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, and on the other side of the screen is Rob from F1 Fantasy Hub. We host a show called the Fantasy Formula before every race to break down some of the biggest news and notes around the F1 fantasy game. And then Rob and I share some of our lineup predictions and what we're going with for the week. But with this deadline more crazy than ever with the surge of Ferrari, some recent news about Perez and some engine problems, we think this live stream is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, so exciting! First time. Good to see a couple of names, familiar names in the live chat too. Hey Mike, hey William. But yeah, Adam, super pumped, dude. It's we've been talking about this for a little while, and I mean it's 9 o'clock here on the East Coast in the US. Imagine it's early afternoon for a lot of people over in Europe. But yeah, I'm super excited. Hopefully, yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
I want to jump right into William's question about autopilot because this probably stems from the recent news about Checo. So at the end of FP3, there have been a couple of leaks, maybe pun intended, about a power unit leak in the Perez Red Bull. Does that mean they'll struggle to get him to the line for the start of qualifying? Obviously, if he doesn't qualify, you'll take the 5-point penalty for not classifying, but he starts P20 in that Red Bull. The overtake possibility is endless.
Yeah, I'm really split. I've still been split on my team for probably the last 24 hours. We've seen some really good performances from Carlos in all three practice sessions. So he's obviously one route for people who are not inclined to use Limitless. But yeah, do we go for the minus? If Perez is obviously not classified, do we take the risk of that -5 and then hope the overtakes and positions gained offset that? Do we hope he makes it into at least Q1? I'm really not sure. So I think the next 57 minutes are going to be pretty pivotal.
Yes, and Mike says in the chat, as soon as the pre-quali show comes on, we should see what that news is. You'll see both of us a little bit busy in the background too, just checking, refreshing Twitter, refreshing on Google, just to see if anybody's got the latest on it. To the question about autopilot, I think it depends on how high you think Perez will get and how much you believe in Ferrari. If you think it's going to be max, the two Ferraris, and maybe Mercedes or something, and the highest Checo can get is P5 or 6, you might be better off with Verstappen. But if you think Perez can get up to the podium positions with all those overtakes, maybe launch him into driver of the day, that's the inflection point where it'd be worth using the autopilot.
Yeah, 100%.
I personally already blew through my autopilot, so I can't do it, but I think it's a very, very close call. I'd be happy with it either way.
Yeah. Look, I think it's like Limitless 2, which a couple of people are certainly weighing up. I've thought about. It's quite interesting because not even 3 or 4 days ago was chip usage on, I really think, either of our radars. We've seen the performances for Ferrari that have really prompted the Limitless discussion. Then the Perez leak just recently, autopilot. I mean, for me personally, I do have autopilot and Limitless available. I went into, after the first 4 or 5 races, went into the remainder of the season with the expectation that I'd be using both of those chips on a sprint weekend. I think the Limitless, I'm certainly still going to use it at either Qatar or Circuit of the Americas. As for autopilot, I'd probably be more inclined to use it this weekend. Again, haven't really given it a great deal of thought. And I think, given I've already made up my mind about generally when I want to use them, I probably won't today. But again, let's maybe let the chat decide my fate.
That's the beauty of this live stream. We might be swayed a little bit by peer pressure. We have a few of our peers that have already said on Twitter that they're using their Limitless this week because there's so much faith in Ferrari. Number one, they obviously look really good. I just saw a track dominance chart of Verstappen and Sainz, and they're really neck and neck for a lot of the circuit. And then also just out of concern for their transfers, if you use the transfers too heavy to bring in Ferrari assets without the Limitless, then you have to use all those transfers to get back into McLaren next week. So very tricky.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's tough. I think, there's certainly a case to be made. I've talked about it on Twitter. You've mentioned it as well around Limitless. I think it's a great opportunity to get the Ferrari guys in. And I think Perez I mean, Christopher mentioned in the chat a couple of minutes ago, like Limitless to get Perez and the Ferrari drivers. I think if you're using Limitless this weekend, you've got to triple up on Ferrari. I would say triple Red Bull too, and probably Lewis Hamilton as that seventh slot. So, I mean, that's kind of where I stand if I was to use it. But again, I probably won't. It obviously means whatever team you've got or had in the prior week, you have next week. But I'm not too phased with running McLaren as my constructor this week, to be honest.
Part of the reason why I'm leaning that way too is the cost advantage of keeping McLaren in, and this is for people that were just going to sub in some of those Ferrari assets. I think it'll be tricky when you think about McLaren have been building this momentum of money, which does carry over week to week, where I think even with an okay race, Lando, Piastri, and McLaren could still stand to gain some cost cap too. So just building towards something in the last part of the year.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think look, McLaren's pace throughout practice wasn't super underwhelming. Like Lando came in second in free practice 2. I mean, Oscar was 4th then. Obviously, practice 3, where I think they were probably trying out a few new things. I'm not going to assume that because I didn't watch the entire practice session. But Oscar was a little down the way, and so too was Lando. But at the same time, I don't think they're going to struggle quite as much as maybe it was made out to be. I don't think they're going to be contending for podiums like we may have been accustomed to the last few weeks, but I certainly think they'll be in the mix for points.
It'll be really interesting. This week is particularly strange because of the alternative tire allocation. You have teams that are not only trying to do qualifying sims versus race sims, they're trying to do those qualifying sims on soft, medium, and hard tires, low fuel, high fuel. So it's really hard to make sense of what we're seeing from some of these numbers we're seeing. Lando posted a really strong result in FP2, but then would go afterwards and say, hey, on heavier fuel, on harder compound tires, I was really struggling. So I would keep your hopes for me pretty low going into Sunday. So I don't know if he's just playing coy or if there really is something to worry about there.
Yeah, I mean, the qualifying sim paces for McLaren were actually pretty encouraging. They were, 0.2 of a second off Ferrari and Red Bull. So I certainly think that they're in with a shot at starting, pretty or some way up the grid. But when you look at the race simulation paces on F1, they regress a little bit over the course of an entire race. So what that means for our fantasy teams, I'm not quite sure. I've got them up on the screen here, and I mean, yeah. What's your read on this, Adam? Because I think they're always very useful metrics to gauge how teams are going to perform heading into every race. But I think kind of what we've talked about this week already, that higher load, high downforce setup that McLaren runs probably won't be as beneficial to them at a circuit like Monza.
It's funny, we were talking earlier about how the ATA throws a monkey wrench into looking at this. Usually I rely pretty heavily on the simulation pace data to inform who I want to pick for my team. But at the top of this exact article, it says, I don't know, guys, there's a lot going on between the ATA, different fuel loads. So we're going to try to make the most of it that we can. And here's the data. So even F1 are caveating their own article that we'll see.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting to me is Williams, and like Kev's called it out, Michael's called it out in the chat too. I think or at least I certainly expected Albon to probably maybe not surprise us because he's been in such a purple patch before recently, but I thought he'd be a little higher up some of the practice charts. He's obviously been top 10 for the most part, but I suppose maybe the expectations were a little too high for Albon coming into Monza because I, for some reason, had it in the back of my mind he'd be kind of top 5 across all 5 practice sessions and be in a pretty good position on the grid to kick Sunday off.
One thing that I noticed, I'm just looking through Formula Data Analysis, who's one of my favorite follows on Twitter. The good news for this is that Williams posted the fastest top speed in both FP2 and FP3. So while Albon may have some struggles in the slower parts of the course, it's going to be really difficult to overtake him. So the other thing, there are a few questions about one or both Williams. And Rob, you had posted in our video earlier this week a double Williams lineup. There was a lot of feature in FP2 and FP3 about the different loads that they're putting on Albon versus Logan Sargent. Sargent's weighing a little bit more downforce to try to give him some more balance and grip in the corners. I'll be interested to see what that does for his top speed and how they'll differ in qualifying.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I did talk about that to some degree, and I think the thing, excuse me, that probably appeals most to me about Logan Sargent is the fact he's such a low-owned asset in the game. I think he's 8%, or at least was when I last looked. And so if he does well, and I think he's got certainly the potential to do so in that car that just looks rapid on the straights, he could feature in and around the points. You could have a few overtakes with that pace. I wouldn't be surprised if he did come away with a double-digit performance, but at the same time, he is that rookie driver that we've come to know carries a bit of risk, has had 3 DNFs on the season. So I'm probably not so inclined to go with him at this point as I might have been a few days ago. But at the same time, I don't think he's by any means a bad pick. And as you pointed out, probably the best pick out of that kind of sub 5 million bracket.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say to Kev's point about doubling up on Williams. If you're 5 million or less and you're in between Nico Hulkenberg or Liam Lawson in his second race and Sargent's got the highest upside there. If you're in between Sargent and say a Zhou or Sonoda, I would go with those drivers that have a little bit more history.
Yeah, I'm the same. I mean, the qualifying pace is really good for Zhou and Sonoda. Being at the very bottom means, obviously I'm not going to make too many assumptions, but if that's kind of gospel, then we'd expect Zhou and Sonoda to probably not make it out of Q1 or be like pretty low down in Q2. Looking at the race pace, if I just go down a little further, Alfa Romeo ascends up the order a little bit. So I think that really puts Zhou in the box seat for those overtakes, and he is the overtake merchant for a reason. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon if he can really translate that pace on Sunday.
For sure. And we have a stretch of questions in the chat about Limitless. I'm prepared to say it now. I'm not going with Limitless. And if for no other reason, just try to differentiate a little bit. Some of our peers are doing about as well as we are in the overall game. They've already committed to the Limitless chip. I plan on saving it either for Qatar or Coda. And then if by any chance something's very weird for Brazil, but that's a bit risky because then it could be wet and it's also the last sprint race to do it. So then you don't want to save it for Vegas or something that's really crazy late in the season. So that's what I'm looking at. Maybe a few extra points in the sprint, maybe a little bit more at Coda and Qatar in terms of overtakes as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I'm in exactly the same camp. I think what appeals to me about Qatar is that it's almost certainly going to be a dry race. I mean, when was the last time rain was forecast in the Middle East? I don't really know, but I think that's a really good omen. The only reservation I have about using Limitless then is that it's not a circuit that we've really raced at in any recent time. So it probably just means that a lot of the drivers are maybe a little unfamiliar with it. Obviously, they do their sims on all of the circuits, but at the same time, Kota, I'm actually going to Circuit of the Americas, so maybe if I have Limitless, then it could really make or break my weekend. But they're probably the two, as you say, that I'm most inclined to use it at. And for Interlagos, obviously the other remaining sprint race, Mercedes do have a stronghold there. Lewis, George, all driven quite well the last few years there. So, and there's obviously a degree of wet weather, or at least what we've come to learn over the last few races there. So maybe autopilot potentially for me. I haven't given it much thought over the break because I know the sprint races are so far away. But I think realistically, it's probably later in the season I use those chips.
That's what I'm hoping for. And I'm seeing a few people now that are posting their Limitless lineups across Twitter. By the way, I'm at an age where I'm calling it Twitter and not X. I'm calling it now. It is Twitter. People posting their team's triple Ferrari. And I posted a meme earlier from the Pixar Cars movie of Guido and Luigi with their Ferrari, all of their merch on. And I think a lot of folks are really pulling for the Tifosi this week.
Yeah, it's good that, people are confident about them at their home race, but they haven't really performed quite as well historically as we would hope. So maybe that's a change in fortunes for them. It's also Carlos's birthday weekend, so fingers crossed he can
good vibes everywhere.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to the news on Perez, he's the driver on my shortlist that I'm looking at bringing in if I decide not to take the risk of him hitting that not classified. So it's very much a dilemma. We've got 45 minutes to decide still, but I guess that was one of the options. If I decide not to move with Perez, it'll be Sainz coming in for him.
Agreed.
Do we want to take a look at that's the browser. Take a look at teams, or I mean, before we go into that, Fantasy Tools had some pretty interesting insights after practice. Maybe we take a dive into that. I think I'm looking at the right. That wrong one. If
you go to the team calculator.
That's right. Yeah.
And for anyone who doesn't use this site, it is just amazing. And they have an analyst that updates a model that predicts race performance after FP2. And then he just updated a little while ago after FP3. And you can see the team is stacked pretty heavily on Ferrari with even 2x on Sainz.
Look, I think that's the budget is probably a little low. Should we put like 125?
Yeah, if you put let's put something a little closer to ours. But I think you're still going to have a heavy Red Bull Ferrari. Yeah. The Ferrari constructor and Sainz in many of those lineups.
That's really interesting.
Now, I want to show you something else that is part of my consideration this week. If you scroll down a little bit back to the, see that purple dot on the bottom of the filters where it says price, add that back in.
Yeah.
So this is a tool that they added in the last few days where this same analyst has found a predictive model of how much will these values change, the price values, based on the expected performance in the Grand Prix. And so you can see which teams are most likely to gain value.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, these guys are absolute wizards with the analytics. It's really changed how we approach this game. Like, I remember last year I was living out of an Excel spreadsheet for the entire season. I know Tom, Poppan Man, was doing the same thing. And I've certainly diverted away from that to use this resource. It's certainly the best tool out there that I'm aware of. So the fact that they've been able to introduce the price change metrics is pretty impressive. I think for me, going back to your point around Ferrari, like they look rapid. Sainz in particular looks really good. And I've said he's very much a driver I'm potentially getting into my team. But am I willing to go in on the constructor too as a non-limitless person? Probably not.
Rob, I think we've terrified the chat. We put in 125 as the budget, but I think you and I are closer to 120.
Yeah.
See Mike setting us straight in the chat.
Sorry.
I looked at my team. I'm at 119.1, so I'm a little bit lower than him.
Okay, sorry. I haven't looked at my team value in a few days.
It's okay. I think we've scared the chat. I think we're rolling in the dough here.
Mike, I saw Mike. I wasn't sure if that 199.9 was a typo or he's somehow the new hacker man. So yeah, 120. Did I hit recalculate? But I think the builds are not going to be too dissimilar. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think now what the builds are shifting toward is something we've talked about all week is keeping a piece of McLaren, but they're recommending the Piastri move rather than the constructor.
Why don't we, in this case, because you and I are not going with Ferrari, just take them out of the equation?
Wait, you took out McLaren?
Did I? Oh, sorry. I'm on autopilot. Not the chip, just up
in life.
Yeah, I was out a lot later last night than I expected, so I'm a little tired this morning, but I hope that doesn't implicate my decisions this morning. So yeah,
look at this double Ferrari driver.
I'm surprised by Joe and Hulk, to be honest.
That's a little wild for me.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm that ballsy, and to get a team like that for me would mean uprooting pretty much the foundations of what I've already got with Alonso, Perez, Piastri. So that's like off the bat a -4, potentially a -8 hit.
Yeah, a -4 to -8 here, and then another -4, -8 next race out.
To get back for Singapore. Yeah. So yeah, I'm the same as Mike. I'd have to wildcard this too. It's I mean, if you're taking more than a couple of hits, then obviously I think wildcard's justified. I think though the most maybe not like intriguing, but certainly what surprises me with the transfer penalty is that, you know, we're scoring 200, 300, in some cases 400 in some teams last week, plus points every week. You put a -4 or a -8 on that, that's like 1%, 2% of your score for the week. That's de minimis. It's like a non-factor. So if it's worth getting in a driver that you think is going to score, you know, 10 plus points compared to what you had, then I don't think you should even worry about those hits.
Yeah, you and I both took -4 last week, and it still worked out just fine.
Yeah. I'm not planning to take another one this week. I've taken two weeks in a row, so might just be a little less trigger happy on the trades heading into Monza. Have you seen any more news on Perez? I admit I'm not on Twitter because
I
I
am
obviously got control
actively
of the
poking
screen.
around. I don't see anything yet, but chat, I encourage you, if you hear anything first, by all means, feel free to break it for us, and we'll say it nice and loud here.
Yeah. I mean, Hakon made, if I've pronounced that right, Hakon, Alonso versus Norris. What's your stance on those two?
That's a great question. Can you pull that sim data back up that we were looking
Sure.
at the beginning?
Race or quali?
So you can see they're right on top of each other. So it'd really just be how you're feeling. Obviously, it was a tale of 2 free practice sessions for Lando. It was P2 in FP2 and then dropped quite a bit in FP3. I think it was out of the top 10. So having a hard time making sense of what to make of Lando. And, you know, as I said earlier, he's outwardly pretty pessimistic about his race pace. He said FP2 was a bit of a fluke because you're running soft tires on low fuel, but in a race, you're doing something much different. So I'm worried that Lando could put up a good qualifying result and fall a bit during the race.
Yeah.
And we talked a bit on the show earlier this week about a comparable race a few weekends ago where Lando started, I don't know, probably P7, P8, fell all the way down to the mid-teens. It took a rainstorm to bail him out and get him back into the top 10. So if he's running slow at the beginning, it could get really ugly. So I guess to answer that question, I would say I'm leaning Alonso.
Yeah, I'm probably the same. And again, he's already in my team. It's unlike you, I wasn't in on Norris for Zandvoort, so I don't really think there's much of a dilemma for me to be made. The latest news on Perez that I can see is that they are changing Sergio Perez's power unit ahead of qualifying. So what I can see here is that with the power unit coming from its reserve pool, Perez will not be subject to a grid penalty.
Whoa. Okay. So let's reset then. So Perez, let's assume, is ready for qualifying with a fresh power unit. He won't take the -5 for not classifying. He won't take the penalty, so it limits his overtake upside, but he should be flying.
Yeah, he should be. I mean, I fully expect Red Bull, both him and Max, to be pretty close to pole position. So we'll see. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that he sprung a surprise on us in qualifying this season, but I'm trying to remain optimistic. It's not too, you know, assuring, you know, right before qualifying kicks off that he has had that leak, because you want every certainty that your premium drivers in your team are going to perform well. So maybe I don't end up going with Sainz. I'm still, you know, 50-50 right now, and I've got 36 minutes to decide. Do we want to take a look at kind of where our teams are at the moment and talk about that?
Yeah. While you pull that up, just wanted to say thanks to Juan Carlos in the chat. I appreciate the love. This is a brand new show and my first year even getting into the analysis of F1 fantasy. So this has just been such a wonderful, supportive community. So yeah, I'm really grateful for each and every one.
Truly, I don't think if it was for all of the encouragement and support from everyone in this community that we'd be doing something like this an hour before qualifying. So, yeah,
it's really funny the difference between F1 fantasy and people that have takes just on the actual product of F1. Because I think a lot of times in F1 fantasy, everything is statistically based. You and I are two of the top 1% of the players in the world. So when we say something, there's not a whole lot of challenging to it. But if you ever, like the few times I've made little comments on actual race stuff, everyone says, shut up, you don't know wheel. So it's a very, very different community.
Polarizing when you're outside F1 fantasy. I agree. So yeah, this is this is where my team's at. I know you had a slightly different setup last race, and we'll try and address a couple of questions I think we might have missed in the chat. So Christopher mentioned a few minutes ago, best budget driver for this week, Sonoda, Joe Hulk, Sargent, or Liam Lawson. I think we've probably talked about that a little already. Do you want to take the wheel on what our stance is?
So in my mind, I think the sim data had Joe a little bit faster than Sonoda, but I would be equally happy with either of them. Like if you're thinking about -4 for a transfer to go from one to the other, I don't think they're that close that it's worth it. So Joe, then barely after that Sonoda, then Sargent, the best of the lower tier ones, because that Williams has a lot of upside, particularly on the overtakes on the straight, even if he's losing those positions again. And then I'm notoriously anti-Hulk, so I'm going to say Lawson, riding on the hot hand of last week. And this is, I think, the last track on the calendar that he has experience in. He took pole in F3 a few years ago at this track, so Lawson is familiar with it. I don't expect any issues, and it's a dry weekend. So I also think Hulk could do the Hulk, where he qualifies P7 and then finishes P15.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And, with the no wet weather forecast, track temperatures will be a little higher on the Sunday. And you know what? We all know what his tire degradation is like on that Haas. So,
that's what I was going to say too, for the people that are really into Ferrari. So usually it's the tracks that are tougher on tires that we always warn about Haas and Ferrari, but it's going to be nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the air tomorrow, probably much hotter on the track. It might not be that easy for Ferrari tomorrow.
Yeah,
that's put that into the world.
Yeah, that's probably why I'm not really in thinking about the Ferrari constructor at all. I think Sainz is certainly a good swap for Perez if you want a piece of that Ferrari pool, but I don't think I'm by any means piling in on it. I think Limitless is a different question altogether. They've looked rapid, and a couple more questions around Limitless in the chat, how that works. I think we'll just, for the benefit of those of you guys who are not as familiar with it, just rehash it again. You get unlimited budget for 1 week. The team you had in the previous week goes back after the race you use it at, and the value of that team you had in the previous race is also retained. So you don't gain any money from using that chip for 1 week. Whatever your team value was the week before is what you have the following week.
And what's tricky is, Robert's question is, what is it the team I have right before I put on Limitless? Like if I make the changes, then put on the Limitless, does it go back to those changes I just made? Unfortunately, it's the team from the previous week.
Yeah. So, I mean, that shouldn't disincentivize anyone if they feel strongly about it. But as we've talked about, probably not for us. Yeah, great point, Mike. Let's do a poll on Limitless in the chat. How do we do that? I think we have to. If producer Greg can help set up a poll.
Bail us out, Greg.
On YouTube, Limitless, yes or no, or Limitless, no Limitless, see if that works. But it seems like a pretty split vote this weekend. I know we've talked about it a little bit, and understandably so.
While we give Greg a minute to look on the poll, I agree with Hakan in the chat, worried about Sargent as the new crash merchant. He found a new way to cause damage in FP3, so he went off the track just into the gravel and kicked up enough gravel that it broke his left hand rearview mirror, and so that put him in an awkward position. So they had to sub that out. But I do worry a bit. The other reason I worry about Sargent too is that they, like I mentioned earlier, they're running a much different setup for the downforce, giving Sargent more downforce, more balance to prevent those errors, but that might take away from his top speed.
Yeah, it's I don't know. Sargent's a tricky one. I think, as I've said before, I'm not trying to overcommit myself to trades this week to A, not take a hit, and B, if I only go with one transfer, i.e. getting Albon in for Oscar Piastri, have that flexibility when we get to Singapore. It's a street circuit. It carries a degree of risk too, and I may end up using the no negative there. So having a team that I think set up to take advantage of that, whatever the build is, having a few more trades is probably where I'm at. So yeah, I know I got this up on the screen probably 10 minutes ago, and we still haven't looked at haven't looked at teams,
Yeah.
but this is kind of where I was for Zandvoort. Look, I don't think I'll be running this exact team, but the two builds that I've kind of come down to with 30 minutes to go, as has been pointed out, is if this would probably be one where it's just a straight swap, Piastri out, Albon in. The second one I'm thinking about is if we put Piastri back in, is if I was to take out Perez, if this news sways me a little bit away from him, move him in for Perez, and then I'll just have enough for Albon to come in there. What are your thoughts on those two lineups?
I want to like Sainz. It's birthday weekend. He's cruising. I think they've tuned the engines up a bit with some of those new parts that they put in this weekend. Home crowd. I just really have a hard time trusting Ferrari. And I think they're also lower on the scale of assets that will grow prices this week because they're already their points per million is already a bit low. Mm-hmm. So I would probably lean toward a Sainz-less lineup.
Yep, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, I still haven't really made up my mind yet. So I think because I'm just so high on Perez because of that overtake potential and that speed of the Red Bull, and the fact that it's likely he will be featuring in qualifying makes me think he's going to be a very sound pick for Monza. So that was kind of the lineup I landed on back on Tuesday, and I'm probably still there as of right now, but you never know.
Greg tells me the poll is live. So check it. So I'm dying to see who is going with Limitless this week. And then just to follow up, Robert, yes, it would be pointless for you to use your precious transfers to try to set yourself up for price gains. So it's just going to go back to your team from Zandvoort. Mm-hmm. And that'll help you too. If you were to use Limitless this week with no other transfers before that, you'd probably get that extra transfer carryover into Singapore next week. So I wouldn't advise, if you're going to use Limitless, making any other changes.
I think also a good call out by Andrew there around Aston Martin. I obviously don't have the desire to pivot into Aston Martin because of the trade situation, the fact I'm not wildcarding. I think Alonso's look pretty good. The qualifying and race paces are encouraging for Aston Martin. I think they're certainly a viable second constructor. For me personally, I can't see myself running any other constructor as my second constructor other than Aston Martin or McLaren for the rest of the season. But this weekend it'll be McLaren. Do you have what's your take on Aston Martin as a constructor for Monza?
In my mind, if I had to rank the drivers of those two teams for this week, I would say Alonso, Lando, Piastri, Stroll. Yeah. And so I think the sum of Lando and Piastri will do better than Alonso and Stroll because Stroll's floor could be quite low, as we saw in Zandvoort. That's why I'm going to keep McLaren. But I think in terms of both price and points upside, they're both very close. I'm not enthusiastically against Aston Martin. If someone has, say, the old metal lineup, you'd be fine with that too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we saw a lot of people last week who ran Aston Martin really haul on the points front. So a little bit of team envy there, but I've made my bed for McLaren, and I think they've still got some potential to rise. Mike pointed out that Sainz could have, along with the McLaren assets, some potential to continue to rise in price. So I think if you're chasing a little bit of extra team value, then holding on to McLaren as a constructor is certainly more than viable.
Great.
So yeah, what's your?
We're getting close to a point where we've got to lock it in, Rob.
I know.
How would you like to do this? Would you like to go first, or do you want to take some of the pressure off?
I mean, you can if you want. I'll just refresh my team so I don't accidentally book something in.
If it helps, since you're sharing, I'm going to hit the post button on Twitter. So if you want to just go to my
Twitter,
my latest Twitter post, you will see I have locked it in.
What's the great man F1 Fantasy HQ? There we go. There we go.
So
that's it.
We're going boring, classical, something that I think could raise in price with a pretty low floor. So obviously Verstappen with the 2X, Checo with a fresh power unit at a track that they should do well in. Keeping on with Alonso and Albon from last week, both with, say, P5 to P7 potential, which will have a good solid week for both of them. I really like Alex in a redemption race. This is the circuit last year where he was hospitalized. He had the appendicitis, complications from the surgery. Like, I think there's a chance that if he does really well, he could get the emotional driver of the day nod. And then Zhou Guan Yu, I think basically every 2 or 3 weeks I go back to him, and I think he could really light the circuit up for overtakes. So that's what I'm thinking this week.
Yeah. Those qualifying and race simulation paces for Alfa Romeo really encouraged me to stick with Zhou. I mean, there was obviously, as I said, a case to be made for Sargent if you want to play that differential, but it's the consistency that really draws me back into the Alfa Romeo driver. And personally, we've just seen him consistently deliver, all season in a car that hasn't looked that great, but realistically can still churn out fantasy points. So as I said, this is going to be one of two potential teams I move with, but we'll see. We've got 23 more minutes, and anything could happen. I've watched Tom Popandman do deadline streams where he's been swayed by the viewers at the last minute. I'm not sure if I've got that in me, but again, someone might say.
I don't know if this will sway you, but the data from our poll says 73% are going no limitless. So it looks like the people are starting to agree with us. Hopefully we steer you right and that there is an absolute banger in your future for COTA, Brazil, or Qatar.
I felt like last week I was in the minority as well with the team build that included Perez. A lot of people obviously ran no Perez, Lando, Oscar, Albon, Fernando. And I don't have any reservations about the decision I made. If it wasn't for that DNF that Joe had, I would have been right up there with you guys. But it's a bit reassuring now seeing that I'm back in the in the majority for this week with no limitless.
Great programming note from Greg in the chat, because Alex asked, what are our predictions for places 1 through 5? FanAmp actually has some really great prediction games that we play every week. So there's a qualifying game and then a race game. Sprint weekends, there's a third predictor for sprints. And then we sum up the points, and then the winner across all the FanAmp community wins some great prizes. I actually won a prize myself a few weeks ago. So it's a ton of fun. And then it sums your points over the course of the whole season. So there's some bragging rights in there too. I'd be interested to see who can beat Rob and I in some of our predictions. And also, we post ours in the Fantasy Formula channel on FanAmp. So I'll keep you all on the edge of your seats. Head over to FanAmp and check out what our predictions are.
Yeah, I think you've got the edge on me at FanAmp. You had, interestingly for this week, Williams fastest through the speed trap as one of the picks. Do you still feel that confident?
Yes. Fastest overall speed in FP2 and FP3. I'm almost cocky about that pick.
Okay. All right. We'll see. We will see. Should we go back to the chat?
Yeah. Some good questions in the chat. Hulk or Logan, if you have under 5 million, I think Logan's got the higher upside. Hulk strikes me as a guy that will qualify high and sink a bit, whereas Logan, worst case scenario, will hover in the teens and not hurt you too bad.
Yeah. Alonso over Norris for me. I think, as we've talked about, I want to make sure we've covered everything. Juan Carlos said Verstappen, Perez, Sainz, Joe Lawson, Red Bull, McLaren. That was one of the builds on Fantasy Tools where you had 3 premium drivers and 2 budgets.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I'm quite as adventurous for that, but it does look pretty powerful, doesn't it?
If you're going with, if you think Ferrari has enough mojo, that just gives you enough of a piece of Ferrari where you can sleep well at night if they do well and not kick yourself too much, but also if they have a tough day, you can still rely on Red Bull. McLaren would probably be the benefactor if Ferrari has a bad day. You've got the overtake merchant in Joe. I'd maybe consider switching Lawson to Sargent, but that's 6 of one, half dozen of the other kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And then Hakon had the question for, I think this is when I was sharing my lineup, Alex over Piastri. So F1 Fantasy Tools, that simulation disagrees with me. Their simulations have Piastri over Alex. I'm building in a little bit of driver of the day potential on Alex or overtakes.
Yeah, I definitely think the overtakes. Yeah, definitely think the overtakes. The guys at P1 were pretty pessimistic on Albon, so I really hope that doesn't eventuate. I think there is a lot of hype around him, and understandably so. So I'm pretty much hoping for a good race from him. He deserves one, as you said earlier as well, or earlier this week. It wasn't a great omen for him last year at Monza with his appendicitis. So hopefully he can get the points finished that De Vries scored last year.
So Finn in the chat says Ferrari and Joe with a 4-point hit, or McLaren and Sainz. I know. These are the good questions.
Yeah, they're great questions. I'd probably say Sainz, to be honest.
I'm going to pop over to F1 Fantasy Tools myself just to see if I've got any data to help me out here.
That's my impulse, McLaren and Sainz. But Ferrari, that's too. I think what scares me a little bit is that even though they have looked great in practice and the sim paces are encouraging, things could still go very wrong for Ferrari. There's nothing to suggest they've moved past all these strategy issues. No tires at the pit stop. I know that's probably classic Ferrari, but at the same time, things could certainly go wrong. And as Murphy's Law says, what could go wrong will go wrong. So
that happens a lot. And I'm looking. So now the findings from F1 Fantasy Tools are that Ferrari and Joe should score slightly more points, but McLaren and Sainz have slightly higher price upside. So as you think about what sets you up best for future weeks, for my team personally, that's McLaren and Sainz. And then Ferrari and Joe, the 4-point hit will dilute the slight points benefit that they have. So if you call them about equal, that would push me toward McLaren and Sainz.
Yeah, good point.
Let's see. Moroccan Gem, Hulk versus Sonoda. You know me, I'm in anybody but Hulk. Give me Yuki.
Yeah, I'm the same. The next one, Alex and Joe, +4. I assume that's a -4. Yeah, it is. Versus Piastri and Lawson. I still think that's tough. I still think, given I'll be running the Albon Joe combination, a -4 is not enough to discourage me. And Lawson obviously has that rookie driver risk, so I'm probably on the Alex and Joe train, to be honest.
Yes, I'm biased because I did start Alex and Joe, so that's where I'm at. But Piastri, if he has a decent race, I think sat out some of the price gains 2 races ago. So I think his next good race, he is due for a pretty beefy price increase. But I think Alex and Joe for me.
Yeah.
Ooh, and then Gasly, Stroll, or Albon. This is part of our chat from the show earlier this week. We're looking at that number 4 driver price tier. And I would also lump Piastri in with this. I would rank them as Albon, Piastri, Gasly, Stroll.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement. As we talked about on, was it Wednesday night? Stroll is, or your morning, whenever that was, Stroll is so far out of the template now. He's no longer the reliable Aston Martin mid-price driver, that we came to know and love through the first half dozen or so races, but he's fallen so far out of the conversation now. The Aston Martin upgrades have obviously worked for Fernando, and he's weaseled his way back into the template discussion, but Stroll is kind of a bit forgotten nowadays.
Rob, the chat's reminding us that they're starting to lock in. Let me knock out a couple questions on this chat while you navigate back over your team
I'll do that.
And get yourself settled.
Yeah, I think it'll be, unfortunately for the chat, we'll probably have the same lineups this week. I know you were so close to me now, and there's that wager we've obviously got going, but that may have to wait another week
Yes, for anyone who missed our show, we had this wager. Rob and I both run different teams in the second half league, and whoever scored the least points this week out of the two of us would have to have their team name in that league rechanged. So that bet will roll over to Singapore if we run the same lineup. It looks like Rob's about to lock in the same.
Yeah, we'll lock it in 15 minutes before. It's plenty of time. I also probably need to post my team on Twitter. So
yeah, you take a second and post your team. I'll do a quick lightning round through the chat. Dan says Perez or Sainz. If it's the same money for you, Dan, Perez on a fresh power unit, I think can now catch up to Sainz, even though he had that blistering pace in the free practice. Let's see. What else
have we got? Yeah, Mike. Albon is the lock. We're locked in 15 minutes before the deadline.
Yes.
And just fire this off.
Alex is locked in for triple Ferrari. I will be praying for you, Alex. I hope in front of that crowd, it would be electric if you could get one or both Ferraris on the podium, because that means you'll probably have a Red Bull knocked down. They'll keep Mercedes at bay. I think just for the sport, that result would be electric. Piastri and Ferrari or Sainz and McLaren. Oh, for me, it's Sainz and McLaren all day, Christopher. I like the upside of Sainz, and McLaren, I think, can still gain a little price through here. Ferrari, you're playing dangerously with both drivers potentially having a tire strategy malfunction or an execution thing. It's hard for that team to avoid mental mistakes and strategy issues and execution issues. So I worry about that.
Give me 30 seconds more and I'll fire this team off, and then we've got...
Not a problem. I'll just keep chatting with the chat. Justin says, do I worry about Stroll? Compared to the other drivers in his price range, I do worry about Stroll. Just he's had some really, really lousy results lately. He didn't show me anything in free practice that terribly inspired me. Meanwhile, you have drivers like Gasly, who was on a podium last week. You have Piastri, who's been on a great run of form. Albon is in the fastest car in the straights on this track. So I consider him probably about the last.
I'm out.
Carlos says, what are our places in the World League? Let me pull this up. I had that open a second
I'll
ago.
show you mine on screen. Team is posted. I'm 8.8 in the world. Keep in mind, though, regardless of where everyone else is on the leaderboard, there's been a lot of people ahead of us that have used their chips, more than just one or two. And for context, Adam and I have used our extra DRS boost. We both used that at the Austria sprint race. Pretty happy with how that went. I've used my final fix at Monaco, which did absolutely nothing for me. I think it was net zero. So they're the only two I've had. So I've got 4 in my pocket with 8 races left. Pretty happy where I stand. What about you?
So Rob is 8,800. I'm 11,956, and I only have 10 points less than Rob. So 3,000 plus teams between Rob and I, but only 10 points between us. And both of us, that's firmly top 1% in the global league with a pretty hefty chip still to play. So you can trust us. This will work.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I just saw something from William in the chat. I'm trying to
Yeah, you want to investigate, see what that's all about?
I'm scrolling Twitter. Yeah.
Because wouldn't that be funny with 2 minutes left after we've locked our teams if there's something nuclear that happens?
I know. Usually we don't have these dilemmas so close to the deadline. You just, usually it's been an engine change for Sergio Perez.
What an interesting week, though.
Yeah.
And I'm thrilled, too, that we're going to have sun all weekend. It's just going to be better racing, one less variable, faster racing.
Yeah, it'll be great. Uninterrupted racing, and I think we'll see the true performance from the Williams, from just about every car. So if anything goes awry for any team, it'll be more often than not at the fault of the driver and not so much the weather. or maybe
That
a
makes
strategy
sense.
team if you're Ferrari.
Mike is going Sonoda instead of Zhou. I like that, Mike.
Nice.
Luckily, you don't get to change my name if you beat me this week, because that could definitely happen. Zhou's been looking pretty fast in the later FP sessions.
Yeah, definitely. I'm liking that. So, other breaking news, albeit probably not true. Christian Horner will be driving the Red Bull.
You know, if he gets one good drive on the Red Bull, that will give him a new appreciation for Perez. That poor guy has caught so much flack for being P2 in the driver standings. It would be great if someone else drove that car for a change and sees how hard it is to stand up to Max.
100% agree. What have we got here? Checkers. So Bryson Sullivan, that's I think the news that Williams referring to. Checo's high speed. I'll see if I can get it up on Twitter actually. Just maybe it's not. Am I not following him? I thought I did.
In the meantime, you look that up. I'll rip through a couple more questions in the chat. So Andrew says, likelihood Piastri makes Q3. I think Piastri just misses Q3, like a P11, P12 kind of thing. And that's just me thinking both Red Bulls, both Ferraris, both Mercedes, Lando, Fernando, maybe an Alpine. Like, I think it's going to be right. He'll be right up against it. Albon up there too, that P10 through P12. I think he just misses out because of some of that slower speed from McLaren at this kind of circuit.
Cool. All right. So, I mean, we've already made our bet on Checo to go back to this. So
Philip in the chat asked to show our teams again. Do you mind just
absolutely, mate.
clicking over to what we went with?
So
Philip, we both went with the same team, so this is an easy view for you. 3 times Red Bull, Fernando, Alex, Zhou, and then McLaren is our number 2 constructor.
Yep. What questions haven't we addressed? I think we might.
Do you believe there's a non-Red Bull driver who will win a race this year?
That's a great question.
I'm firmly on board that someone wins a race that's not Red Bull. I think it's going to be, I think it was you that said it this morning, Rob, inevitably a Max DNF. Some engine failure, tiny mistake and he goes off the track kind of thing. And that's where, oh man, I'm such a big Lewis fan. You can see the shirt. I hope it's Lewis, but if not, I think it could be Leclerc that picks up the pieces.
Yeah, I think the Ferraris are looking really good this weekend. I don't know necessarily if Monza will be that circuit, but I certainly expect Interlagos. I mean, I mentioned that earlier. Mercedes could really put in a solid performance there. We know how well both George and Lewis drive there. Which team? I think it's got to be out of Ferrari and Mercedes, but I can't really say with any certainty when that could be. I'm going to put my money on a Mercedes victory in Brazil, though.
Yes, especially considering there's been a Mercedes at the top of the podium the last few years there. That makes a lot of sense. And, Thomas asked the question, on behalf of all of you that haven't set your team yet, is Perez in a void now? I don't know, because the teams are allowed to repair after the free practices. So to what extent can you repair a floor versus having a brand new power unit and flying? It's hard to say. I'm keeping, if I was in my shoes without a lock lineup, I would still put it.
Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, it's tough, man. I think, I don't know. The main thing is I made my decision before, obviously, that news came through. So that's just what it is. That's the beauty of fantasy.
Awesome.
What else have we got? Sainz and Piastri or Perez and Zhou, considering Checo's recovery drive on Sunday and Ferrari tyre degradation. I'm going to say Perez and Zhou, assuming that that's the team or the build I have, and assuming that these floor reparations obviously come through before the race, then perhaps that's not something to be too concerned about. But 5 minutes before the deadline, get those teams locked in, guys, if you haven't already, because there's Yeah.
Yes. And maybe we can do some other just programming note things. So feel free to check us out. You can see our socials are all down below on the YouTube. Feel free to check out my website, Rob's shows. Together we do the Fantasy Formula One thing. We check us out on FanAmp. We have our own community there, but there are other really great content creators that have their communities there too. There are games and prizes and ways that we all interact with each other. So I totally recommend all of that. And then let us know what you want to see differently between now and Singapore. So, do you want the lineup lock show to flow like this, or do you want us to bring more or different information to the table for that next show?
Yeah, definitely. Always open to feedback. First time doing this, so there's always going to be kinks to iron out. The poll came through, split vote on Ferrari and McLaren as the team to win, if not Red Bull this year. So
Ooh,
very,
fantastic.
very interesting there.
I don't care who, I just want to see it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to as well. I mean, for me, I don't have a strong allegiance to Max, but he is, a generational talent, and I would, as much as some people may disagree, love to see him take that record off Seb. He is so dominant, and we are witnessing greatness. We can debate all we want who the greatest of all time is. I'm not sure if Max is quite yet in that conversation, but we are seeing someone who hasn't really performed quite as consistently and exceptionally in a few years since Lewis was in a very dominant Mercedes. So I'm all for Max to capitalize on how good this car is right now.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a great place to put a pin in it. I think we've got 3 minutes left to set our lineups. Make sure everybody hit the submit button so that you can lock in your lineups for this week. And best of luck to each and every one of you. Rob and I will be posting our scores after each session. Feel free to let us know how all of you are faring and see if our advice pointed you in the right direction this week.
This was awesome. So glad we did that. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you all so much for joining us today. We'll see you right back here for Singapore next time out.